Hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. And today, we're joined here by a friend of mine who I haven't seen in perhaps almost 20 years, Bernard Marszalek and Peter Bloom. And we're going to have a nice chat about Bernard's new book, uh, Jobs, Jive, and Joy. If I remember correctly, Bernard, the way that I first met you was, I think, geez, almost 20 years ago now. And I was just starting to work on a PhD where I was claiming I was going to rethink worker self-management. And we met was it Oakland? Um,
Um, at Arizmendi, the
yeah, yeah,
bakery,
yeah, 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 yeah.
Oakland.
Went to a sort of a worker-owned cooperative pizza place. So it's nice to sort of get back in touch years later, although we've been in touch here and there. And then I thought to have the conversation about your book, which is really quite fun, interesting book, and a great read, put out by a great press, Charles H. Kerr, who are one of my favorite long-standing presses of the sort of like interesting left. But I thought it would be interesting to bring along Peter Bloom, my colleague from Essex, and we're part of a research center cover that's working on trying to rethink and popularize commons-based and cooperative-based forms of organizing. So I thought it would be an interesting way to sort of triangulate some sort of like different things. So thanks for coming along, Peter.
Hi. Um, so I'm really happy to be here and I have to say, I found your book really incredible and I'm very excited to speak about it. So thank you so much for inviting me, Stephen. And as Stephen said, Stephen and I co-founded and are co-directors of this research center cover that really does look at different post-capitalist organizations. Um, I think I was just saying hi though, and you called on me.
No. That's cool. So maybe as a place to start, Bernard, if it's okay, maybe without going too much into life history, which will be an interesting story in itself because you've done a number of interesting things over the years. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit about like how you came to write this book and where it came from. And
Okay, yeah. Good to meet you, Peter. I'm pleased to be interviewed by two outstanding academics who probably aren't recognized for their outstanding work in the way you should be. Um, but so the way I started to write this book, um, so I write essays. I mean, my way of being active in some measure of practicality is to write essays, some on co-ops, quite a few on co-ops, but alternative economics and also some fun stuff. But that's the form of my writing is essays. Maybe I just don't have the bandwidth to write large tomes, but essays are great because my attention span is really limited, and also I have lots of distractions when it comes to what's available. So I was writing before the pandemic um, about Hawthorne Works because my mother was working there, and I didn't realize what it was really, and I came across the Hawthorne effect years ago, and that kind of motivated me to sort of select some issues that I could delve into more reasonably in an essay form. And then it turned out, as I started to do the research on the Hawthorne works and the Hawthorne effect is that sociologists discover that when they're doing research on subjects, um, the results are skewed because they're actually intervening in a way that is not normal in a in a, in a work situation, let's say, which is how that first happened. And my mother has a story about how that developed where she worked at Hawthorne. But anyway, I discovered that there was actually more to Hawthorne than just the monopolistic enterprise that it was at the time. And that is that it had um, this activity called the club. It was first open only to male workers. And after about 3 or 4 years, it was actually opened up to the women workers who at Hawthorne, in the manufacture of the telephones, were the majority of employees. And Hawthorne was a huge operation. It developed just outside the city limits of Chicago, and was now Cicero. At the time, it was called Hawthorne, therefore the name, because the Bell system realized, okay, so the Bell system was the overall enterprise, and the Bell system itself was sort of the research, the Bell Labs system. Also, it was the telephone company, AT&T, and Hawthorne Works was the manufacturing arm. So you had this triumvirate of institutions as part of the Bell system. Of course, this was a total monopoly. Anyway, she began to, I remember her telling me about the Hello Charlie Club, and the Hello Charlie Club was an aspect of the club at Hawthorne. The club at Hawthorne was a after work leisure time, as I interpret it, a leisure time activity sponsored by the company, but basically controlled by the workers. That is, the workers could move to ask for a kind of activity, and the company would generally, I don't know of anything that actually they didn't want on the company time, on the company property. Company property was 300 acres, by the way. I mean, this was huge. And they already had baseball fields, I think 3 of them, tennis courts, and a big gym where basketball was played. I mean, they had all the passive accoutrements of a monopolistic operation that offered some benefits to the workers after work. But the club was different. The club was actually something like a worker proactive aspect. And that was, I thought, unusual. And so I've been in communication with Benjamin Hunnicutt for years. I don't know if you people know of his work. He's written a famous book on time, for example, but he's basically into leisure studies. So I asked him about the Hawthorne Club and what he knew about it. He didn't know anything about it. It was like, what? What was this? I never heard of it. I couldn't believe that. So, I mean, I didn't do any further research on who studied the club, if anybody, but if the main character involved with leisure studies never heard of this, I was pretty much convinced that nobody heard of it in terms of, the academic field of leisure studies. I won't go into why I think that's to be expected, but anyway, so I started to write about the club, and as I did, COVID hit, and I was confined pretty much to my home for over a year, actually. I mean, my son was bringing us food for a while. It was pretty awful. I mean, I'm at the age where if I was going to get COVID, I was told I'd probably die. So, I mean, it was not a pleasant situation to be in, but it did motivate me to write more when I realized after finishing the essay on the leisure activities uh, the Hawthorne works, that there was actually an essay here about time that was being developed. So I started to write an essay on time then. I mean, I don't think we fully appreciate how the workers' struggle was actually a struggle about time. It was actually a politics of time that was, basic to the beginning of May Day in Chicago, the 8-hour day. So, so that issue on, so that essay on time kind of led into my other research that I've been doing for years and years on play. And so then I started to write about how play was involved with leisure time activities and what that meant, and how leisure time activities, non-work activities, let's call them that, could be interpreted as a manifestation of play in our culture. And of course, what is the opposite of play but work? And so then I started to write, which I've done before, an essay on work, but I focused on the origins of work ethic. So anyway, that's how this unfolded. This book unfolded as a series of essays that I didn't see as a whole. I mean, I didn't approach this book as some authors do with an outline and then, follow through in terms of the outline. I just wrote it as a series of essays. And at the end, I was going to just put them on my website. And then I began thinking about how much of an effect that would have. I mean, having a website's like necessary these days, obviously, but having a website doesn't mean that you have much distribution, because there's so many websites. There's so many ways in which people can get involved in the internet. And of course, I have a background in printing, so I published 2 other books pretty much on my own. And so I contacted Kerr, raised the idea of doing this as a book, and they were enthusiastic enough to motivate me to go back, edit it a little bit, send it to a proofreader who hopefully caught most of the grievous errors. And yeah, so now we have this book. And one last point. There are lots of books on work, and there are lots of books that deal with the subject of how awful work is, but there are a few that go into actually the origins of work and the ethic behind it and what it means in a larger sense in terms of the society and its formation of activities. I mean, it's not unusual, I think, to think of leisure being developed as an aspect of the work ethic. It's a way of modifying the awfulness of the work ethic. Of course, it's never stated that way, but that's in fact how I think it's approached by leisure studies. And it's also individualized. It's not collective. So I had to end the book then with something that's missing in a lot of these stories or stories about the aspects of work, and that is like how to overcome it, and what is in fact overcoming it mean in a society that's actually facing collapse. I mean, I wrote these essays 3 years ago, maybe even more. Well, first one was almost 6 years ago, but I was fearful that they wouldn't hold up over the time. But in fact, with civilization collapse, as I see it, it's gotten worse. I mean, the LA fires were just devastating. And there's another fire that you probably haven't heard of, which was a battery fire up the coast from Los Angeles and just a few hours south of where I live in Berkeley, called the Battery Fire. It was an outfit that was storing batteries. Now, batteries are needed to, of course, maintain the follow through of electrical storage from solar and wind. So these batteries were set up in this old unused warehouse, which was part of well, I won't go into it, but it was part of a larger energy source years ago. And these batteries are lithium batteries. All of a sudden, there was a fire in one, and of course, it was a chain explosion throughout the whole factory, and it burned for weeks. I think I'm not sure, maybe the fire is still smoldering there. There's no way to put it out. They just had to let it burn. And the toxic fumes from that would just spread all over. I mean, we're facing a civilization that is slowly, not so slowly in some cases, is marching to its death. I mean, this is this is the future for lots of people your gender. I'll stop there.
Well, that gives us a lot to start with. Thank you for that, Bernard. And I think what I really like about your book is the way that you're working from a history of labor, working from a sort of like a playful conception of politics, working from a history of counterculture, working through dealing with sort of climate catastrophe, and you're trying to do all these things at once, and that's super interesting because a lot of times, particularly more academic texts, tend to only look at one thing at a time. But we don't live in one thing at a time. We live in the conjunction of 15 things at once, and they're all going on at the same time. And so trying to work through all that at the same time is more complicated, but in what in ways more personally more interesting. So a few things. One, just going back to Hawthorne for a second. The first time I heard the phrase Hawthorne effect, I hadn't yet worked in I didn't know about the history of management here, but I was an English major, so I thought it referenced Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I thought it referenced the Scarlet Letter. So I interpret it as if you're branded with the Scarlet Letter and everyone's watching you, you will behave differently. So I ended up with an understanding of what I thought it was that was actually kind of close to the actual reality with just from the wrong direction. But anyways, one of the things I really like about your book, and have you ever read Mark Fisher?
A few essays, but and I skimmed through capitalist realism, but I'm not really familiar with his work extensively.
I'm thinking of in capitalist realism, he has a little phrase where he talks about the idea of depressive hedonia, or the idea that when you get to a state where you can only pursue pleasure, but in a very sort of narrowly individualizing way, almost like pleasure as coping, pleasure as individualistically trying to get by. Um,
Mm.
but I think that what you're offering here is a kind of a counter to that, where it's moments where non-alienated forms of time, non-commodified time became possible, but collectively, whether it was through, the emergence of these clubs at Hawthorne or other forms. And it's trying to sort of say, trying to find those moments, but not in very individualizing forms, but in terms of sort of more collective forms.
Yes, well, this kind of raises some issues here. I don't want to push play in the sense that some people have as simply just the opposite of work, and they kind of leave it at that. I mean, my view here is that what's the orientation of the culture? Is the orientation of the culture based on sacrifice, and is it and that means perform by fact, if it's based on sacrifice, it's individual sacrifice. I mean, this is part of the I hate to say this, but sort of the religious carbuncle that we're involved with here. So I don't want to put play as simply the opposite of sacrifice. I mean, I mentioned the fact that um, toil and play could probably be extremes. So you have a play activity on one end, and then you have absolute toil on the other. Um, does that how do you deal with toil in a culture that's based on what I call radical hedonism? Well, you actually make the toil less toilsome. You try to reduce the amount of toil, and if you could eliminate it, eliminate it. But if you can't, deal with it. And there are several ways in which you can. I mean, those of us who've been involved in worker co-ops um, can see this. It's part of the operation of the daily life in the co-op. Someone is struggling with some project, go in and help them, make it easier, or see if they can even eliminate the project altogether. I mean, is it worth the effort that that person's putting into doing something, or is it not? I mean, it gets questioned, but that doesn't happen in our culture. We don't have the opportunity to change the system. I mean, we have we have a labor movement and we have unions, but there's limitations in terms of what activities the unions can undertake. They have, let's say in Germany, they have a seat at the board, but having a seat at the board and saying, let's do it this way, and everyone nods, and then they go on and do what they want to do anyway, doesn't help anybody. And you can't strike based on changing work situations. At least you can't do it in this country. So, that's a limitation.
Well,
So go ahead, Stephen.
So I would say that's what I found really interesting about the examples of these clubs at the Hawthorne plant, because on one level you could say it's not like how did they get there? It's obviously not just because of the manager of the business were like purely self altruistic people trying to create like goodness for the workers. No, like, and this is one thing you point out, like it was to help generate sort of more identification from the employees, right? Get psychological buy-in. It was that they were doing these things to try to sort of say, oh, you don't have to break apart the monopoly of the business. We can use this. We can show that we're being good, right? We can sort of try to keep unions away, right? So there's a certain ambivalence about having these workers' clubs, but the fact that they were ambivalent doesn't mean that they were still producing forms of time and experience for people in these businesses that were meaningful for them, right?
Yes, yes.
So
But
it's
there's
like,
another aspect here too, which I think is overlooked to some extent. Now, I'm not, you two are probably much more deeply involved in labor and management history than I am, of course. But to me, it seemed to me that the managers, even at the top level of the Hawthorne works, didn't come out of business schools. There were no business schools, I don't think, in the 19th century that you would graduate from. They came out of engineering. They were engineers, they were technicians. And there's a difference between being an engineer and having an appreciation of those who work at your behest and work with you to develop a system that's operable, whatever it may be. I mean, you probably know about tool and die makers and Noble's work with tool and die makers. Um, that, that that there's skills involved that engineers, in their larger overview of what they're doing, would appreciate because it's the minute, absolute development of the techniques the engineers ask for that are developed by workers. And so there's an appreciation of that mix between the engineers and the workers. You don't have that with people who graduate with MBAs. Who are they? I mean, they're just dealing with a bunch of drones. That's as far as they're concerned. They have no respect for the workers who are actually doing the work. Why should they? They don't, they never were involved with them in any way. Simply, they're just order givers. That's all. Um, so I think there's an element here of some respect for the workforce besides the obvious um, mandate to keep unions away. The Hawthorne Works had some unions. The male workers in the engineering department were in the union. What was what was mainly fearful of the Bell system were the operators in AT&T. The operators, okay, so we're talking about a situation where you had a telephone in your house. It was a party line. You shared that telephone line with someone else. And the way you made a phone call is you'd pick up the receiver, and if the other person sharing the line wasn't on that line, you'd go directly to an operator who at a switchboard would plug in your phone into the phone that you're trying to reach. So there was a switchboard, and it had operators actually making the connection. It wasn't done automatically. There were over 100,000 women working as operators in this country. They were not going to be in unions because if they got into a union, that would be like what? Like an explosion of a development. I mean, if one operator section decided, let's say New York, decided to go union, what would stop all the other operators across the country from saying, yeah, that's a good idea? They said they had to stop that. So that was the Bell System's main fear, was that the operators would become union, but that carried out throughout the whole enterprise. But as I said, there were unions at the Hawthorne Works, but they were exclusively male unions, and they were the technicians mainly. And so yeah, so my mother's stories, for example, was that it was an awful job. I mean, she got to the point where she was doing the same routine day in and day out and could do it blindfolded. But she could speak to the people next to her. She wasn't browbeat by supervisors who were told, by the way, not to browbeat workers and to leave them alone, not to, I mean, if there was a grievous effect, that would, of course, they would intervene. But the whole idea of maintaining peace on the floor was based on the supervisors being tolerant of activities that maybe in another location wouldn't be tolerated at all. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that the engineers who are running the Hawthorne works wanted to increase productivity, and how they do it. They didn't call for a speed up. They didn't call for putting more pressure on the workers. They called for an experiment. The experiment consisted of removing some of the operators, some of the workers, not operators, the factory workers, the women, into a separate room with a few managers monitoring their work, and they would experiment. They would turn the lights up, turn the lights down, offer a breakfast in the morning, a longer lunch period. They did all these various things over periods of years to see what would increase productivity. And guess what? Everything they did, lowering the lights, increasing the lights, giving them breakfast, would all increase productivity. There was like there was no way they could determine what they would do to increase productivity because everything did. It was obvious. You know, they were being watched and being appreciated for what they were doing, the women. So they, responded by, working a little faster after a change. But then, went back to a modest level of productivity, but, was equivalent to what was being done on the floor. But, it was an experiment that they fruitlessly tried to realize some benefits from, and they never did.
I wanted to ask a kind of question on this, and the fact that I found one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is that there was kind of two levels at play. Um, Sorry for the pun, maybe. But the first is I think this very interesting aspect about this kind of like I think radical hedonism as a way in which to really, as you said, reorient society towards play, towards less toil, less work intensification, and as a means to not only, if we can, you know, ethically and normatively cope better with the end of world, but actually as the means by which we can actually overcome these. But then I thought there was a very interesting part that I liked a lot that I wondered if you could talk about, which is, and I think it goes a little bit to some of the very initial points Stephen was alluding to in terms of Mark Fisher's work, in terms of, you know, different types of pleasure and different types, is that it seemed that there was actually a quite, and I know that you've said, oh, well, I'm not academic and things, but actually a quite interesting sociological and almost ethnographic account in some of your examples and things in which you actually talk about how it seems that when you take out and extract the work component of work, some of the things like, and I think this is kind of captured in the Hawthorne experience, like working together for something, being productive, feeling acknowledged, and these types of things actually become things that we often associate with capitalist commodification, alienation, and work. In this different type of mentality, become actually things that do give us pleasure and can become more incorporated within an economy of play. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that because I think one of the dangers about reading the book is that you might kind of think, oh, like you're kind of talking about this almost established binary of work and play that we have, but it seemed like you were almost subtly doing something a bit more profound, which is that part of the process of this transformation is that we actually save some of these things that are now kind of devalued, now ironically overvalued in an economic sense because they're associated with work, but devalued in how they can contribute to our enjoyment from commodification and alienation. Like, why is it that we think about productivity or being productive as something, you know, that's just associated with work, right? And I was thinking about this just if I can, like actually, even in our informal kind of like everyday lives outside of work, think about how much joy we do get in working as a team on things, on, working on projects together. I know this sounds very strange, but I mean, it's so interesting just even watching and I hate to use this example, my 8-year-old son work together with his friends as he's playing video games and feeling a sense of accomplishment and productivity and these types of things, which might sound a very strange example to use, but it really struck me. So I wanted to know, maybe ask a little bit about that, about how it seemed like in some of your examples, in some ways you were doing, and maybe I'm just like not capturing it well, or maybe it was something I was reading into it, but it did seem this really kind of brilliant, insightful way in which you were kind of like saying, you know, we can actually expand what play is, right? And things that are typically not associated with play, in fact, kind of are associated with play, and they can become enjoyable again.
Well, we can't play our way out of the collapse of our civilization.
For sure, but
We, and and I think maybe the best example that I bring up in the book is the Hodads. The
Mhm.
Hodads were reforesters based in Oregon, and which has lots of forest. Oregon's a state just north of California for those in Europe who may not know where. Anyway, it began as a okay. So what happened in the forests in all over the West was that the government set up a reforestation program. You could clear cut the forest, remove all the, first growth, second growth redwoods or whatever you were cutting down. But then you had to replant. So who did the replanting? Well, there were contractors working with the government who would hire a bunch of people and they would replant the trees with labor. It was minimum wage. A couple of ex-college graduates in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, actually, devised a way in which they could contract directly with the government, bypass the middleman, and developed over a period of years co-ops who were doing the reforestation. Now, reforestation was really hard work. This is like digging holes to plant trees, and you had to do a lot of it to make your your quota, or you wouldn't be paid. It would be, wouldn't be rehired. In other words, turned out that they actually planted more trees than the contractors, the middlemen, who were contracting low-paid work, and their trees actually maintained themselves. I mean, I don't know, 80, 90% survival rate, and the contractor's rate was like 10%. It was terrible. Um, and the Hodads got their name from the tool they used, which was called the Hogag. And it was a spike on one end. It was a tool at the end of a long stick. It was a spike at one end and a hoe at a sort of a shovel at the other, a very narrow shovel. The spike would break the ground, rip out the undergrowth, and then the shovel end of it would dig a hole just deep enough to plant a tree, a sapling. And this was like backbreaking work. Um, but at the end of the day, they would have these celebrations because they had actually planted, a whole number of trees. They felt that they had actually done something very beneficial in doing this. There was a great deal of satisfaction in the work they did, and I mean, it was so satisfying that their their endeavor just grew. At one point, there were 300 people, men and women. There was actually a lesbian group working at digging these trees, planting the trees. In 17 different, I think it was 17 different groups. So all over the West, this was like a backbreaking job that people actually wanted to do because, first of all, it was useful. Secondly, it was done in collaboration with others who would party afterwards, go back to their camp and have their celebration, whichever form that took, which usually meant some illicit drug heaping. But it was, it was an example of what you're bringing up here of people who were actually doing very miserable toil when you consider it, but doing it collectively, seeing it as as a um, as a sense a competition, which Huizinga in the Culture of Play in his famous book on play um, discusses. Competition is a kind of play, and competition in the right circumstances can, in fact, uh, be a source of great deal of pleasure. Fourier brings this up too. One of his passions is a passion to compete. I think he calls it, forgot what he called it now. It's just the passion of variety is the butterfly passion. And the composite, I forgot now what the passion for competition was, but he did recognize the sense that competing for a better way of doing something would be a benefit to everyone and would be appreciated. And there could be some mixture of competition and composite, which was the solidarity aspect of his passion. So I mean, yeah. So this is and with co-ops, I can't imagine a better way in which people can actually implement the level of work that is pleasurable by having control over that work. So that's my response. I don't know if that gets exactly to what you want to talk about, but I mean, I don't see play as being something that's ideological in the sense of it being a a moral command of some sort. It's a tool. It's a way of seeing how to make what is necessary labor um, a a pleasurable activity as much as possible. I mean, I don't see a socialist work ethic. I don't think what that would be. I can't imagine how it would be devised unless it's devised on the base of I consider radical hedonism. It couldn't be.
Mm.
It doesn't have a substance to my mind. I don't know. I can't imagine how it would work otherwise.
Mm. I think by the way that it's a really great part on 48 in the penultimate chapter, and it's the Kabbalist one that I thought was is really interesting. But yeah, no, I think for me that answers is a really important aspect that you say, and I think it also goes to there's a real, and then I know Stephen has some questions and things, but there's a real, I think, potential joy in actually being able to identify what is essential labor, what do we actually need as society, and I think so much of what is so disempowering is the fact that, as many have pointed out, including David Graeber and things, that most of what we do under capitalism is pretty non-valuable, or I don't know how PG friendly this is or not, Stephen, but I think the technical term that they use is bullshit. So I think in this sense, there's also a joy like in being able to identify what is essential labor and then finding different ways in which, we use the tool of play in order to accomplish it.
I mean, that's an interesting sort of example there is because in that book by David, he has a lot of examples of people who are engaged in work that they know is pointless, and they end up with time, but their time feels empty. Their time feels meaningless. They know they're getting paid, but they actually are criminally depressed while they're getting paid. And when you were talking about the Hawthorne experiments, the work was still crappy, but there was still almost like a level of meaning being produced, a level of engagement that almost went, yeah. It's an interesting dynamic there. And I was thinking about sort of your point about how it gets lost in the history. I'm thinking about like why it gets lost. Um, because if you're finding an approach which sort of, you know, it's not that the work actually becomes amazing, but it gives people sort of a way to relate to it or to create moments of opportunity or semi non-enclosed time for themselves. That's a valuable to me, like a valuable lesson, a valuable history to learn from. In part because
Yeah.
you must have wondered sort of like the role that it played for those people, um, to have that time and to have that relationship with sort of um, a sort of non-enclosed time. And one of the things you say about that is it's almost like there was the moment where there was leisure which hadn't yet been enclosed by the leisure industries. Because now we got to the point where like any free time actually starts to resemble work, right? Because you're constantly bombarded by like do this, do this other thing, engage with this, entertainment product. So it's almost like this moment of where there was a certain sort of freedom in a kind of time that hadn't been yet re-enclosed by enforced leisure.
Well, I'm not sure if this addresses what you're leading to, but this did pop into my mind, and I don't know what. I think there's a way in which we could take um, this sort of subjective aspect of work that people are embroiled in, or what's the best word, I guess, not encumbered, but um, and anyway, it's to take that aspect of the subjective aspect of work that satisfies them today and transfer that to a situation where in the near future, if not now, we have to face a situation where work is going to be imposed upon us just to survive. And how do we take that sense of satisfaction, that subjective satisfaction of work well done today, and transfer that to a situation where work will be somewhat demanded of us to just maintain our society. So, for example, at the Hawthorne, the overriding sense of satisfaction in the work was that they were on the cutting edge of technology. I mean, Hawthorne Works was the Google of the time. It was the communications front end. It was the frontier of electronic um, exploration in terms of material objects. And the workers there, the telephone uh, manufacturers, the operators themselves, and the switchboards, they were the technicians of their time, working in a frontier occupation, and they had a great deal of satisfaction from the fact that they were doing that necessary work, which they saw as necessary, and communicating, offering communication to everybody. I mean, what could be more satisfying than be able to make a telephone call to a relative in another city? I mean, not just across the city, but to another city. I mean, long distance telephone operation. I mean, this was like magic. Um, what's interesting too is that earlier today I was thinking about Alexander Graham Bell and his relationship to Elon Musk. It was an interesting sort of uh, parallel there. I mean, here was Bell inventing a phone and then not having a phone in his own office because he found them to be intrusive and somewhat distracting. I mean, he was a great inventor. He also invented. Well, he got involved in all sorts of. You can Google him and read Wikipedia about Alexander Graham Bell. He was actually born in Scotland, um, and he developed this sense of invention um, because of his early upbringing in terms of being able to access the tools for his inventions in a little workshop. Anyway, all that carries through to what we have today, which in stark relationship is just the contradiction, in my terms, of the Hawthorne works. I mean, here we have Google, and workers at Google taking pride in the fact that they're working for Google because it's the frontline enterprise in America. But what is it in fact? It's just a system of sales. That's all it is. It's just a sales network. I mean, it's kind of upsetting. And then what happens when that 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 their job is basically eliminated for economic reasons because it's it's overpriced and it's based on aspects that they can't control at all. I mean, there's something very material about making a telephone and having that exist as a real tool as opposed to the internet and what it and how it exists today. So I don't know that just crossed my mind. I don't know, Steve, if that actually addresses.
No, the thing it makes me think of. Let's go back to second two. You mentioned the Benjamin Honeycutt book on free time, which I think is really lovely. And one of his arguments, if I remember correctly, is that over the 18th in the 19th into the 20th century, you saw a progressive lowering of working time, right? If I remember correctly, he argues that this basically this keeps going until what, the late 1930s, and then sort of work time goes back up again.
Yeah.
And it's almost like people sort of having gotten some time for themselves, then get bought into a kind of social arrangement where then what they're promised then is sort of more stuff. Like you want to move to the suburbs, you want all the modern conveniences, you want all the sort of like all the gadgets, right? And then it made me think of Peter, who's the I forget the names, the after work book, uh
No, by Helen.
Helen and
Nick.
yeah.
Helen Hester, Nick Shrunick.
Yeah, one of the things they point out is you get all this is you think you get the sort of like labor saving technologies like washing machines and household appliances, but actually people just end up finding new ways to work at home, right? So it's almost like I guess what we're trying to get to is what I think is interesting and valuable in this moment in the 30s is almost like an appreciation of what you can do with the time itself. And that connects to a later point in the book where you're talking about almost like how would you put it? Sometimes it can be hard to try to frame degrowth as a positive thing, right? Because it sounds like austerity, right? Less
Mhm.
stuff. But to my mind, the way to frame degrowth as a positive thing is to emphasize the quality of the time and engagement with that time you have, as opposed to more stuff, more stuff, more stuff.
Well, the thing about Honeycutt's book is that okay, so so the work was decreasing over a period of 150 years from what 16 hours or down to 12, which was a big move, down to 10, which was even greater, and then 8. And then it seemed to level off at 8. And that seemed to be quote unquote natural. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of what you will. Um, but there was one company, Kellogg, in Michigan, Kellogg cereal, that actually had a 6-hour workday. And Honeycutt discusses that and discusses what happened when it actually was by the workers decided to change to the normal 8-hour working day. And what prompted that? Um, First of all, let's say that the women who worked at Kellogg were mainly in favor of the 6-hour day. And that's obvious. I mean, they had to do a lot more labor at home. So if they could do less labor at the factory, they could do more at home. That would be great. But the men actually wanted to have more toys. And that's what brought them into wanting to have more income and be able to afford a boat for leisure time activities or better fishing gear or whatever to enjoy their so-called leisure with more toys. Um, And so, this was this was the great buy-off for the end of any attempt in the 30s with FDR to lower the working hours, which would of course provide more employment. That was the argument, but it would mean for the capitalists that they would be losing some control over their work. I mean, if you go to 6 hours or if you go to a 4-day work week, what's to stop, according to the capitalist thinking, what's to stop then to demand a 4-hour day or, Paul Lafarge's 3-hour day or, a, a work week that was less work than it was leisure. I mean, that would have been an outrage. How would the capitalists make their money? So I think one aspect here that I feel in my book may be overstated a bit because it meant so much for me was the idea of the research that's been done in neuroscience in terms of play. And if I could spend a minute or two discussing that, I'd like to, because there's I don't know if you people know, there's a museum of play in Rochester. I believe it's Rochester, New York. The Museum of Play produces a journal, which is online and available free, the Journal of Play. And I found this years and years ago and been reading excerpts from that journal all this time. And it occurred to me that most of the articles, of course, are very specific to playground material and blah, 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 and not very interesting. But there is also several authors who've spent some time discussing play in more meaningful terms, in terms of child rearing and what it meant for children and what that means, in fact, for how they develop in education, in their educational lives, and also in their creative lives as they get older. And part of that research went into aspects, because now there's the facility to do this in labs, into the study of the brain structure. And it turns out that actually our most primitive part of the brain, the little brain, the brain that exists at the end of our spinal column, actually developed pleasurable aspects from very early on, from its first development. That's pre-human. So so you have the phenomenon here of mice playing, of more elaborate brain structures in chimpanzees as playful activity like humans at childhood in the formative ages. But then you have the bonobos who play all the time, just like adults. They are constantly playing. And why isn't that recognized as vital to the way our culture is set up? Why is it just ignored? Why is it not made basic that, our human species is a play species? It goes way back to before we were human. I mean, you can't deny the validity of that argument, in my opinion. But it's ignored, and partly it's ignored because, the play researchers don't want to get into politics, and it's understandable, I guess. It's unfortunate, but it's understandable. Peter Gray is the only person who I know who actually has ventured into doing some of that research in terms of education. But he stands out as very unique in many ways. And anyway, I bring that up repeatedly in the book because I think I have to emphasize the fact that for me, this was a revelation to see that there was an aspect of our human nature, which is not just our prefrontal lobes. It's not something that came after as an afterthought as we developed our hunter-gatherer motif of living, but actually was more basic than that. So that's why I bring it up repeatedly. But I don't know if it's appreciated much. Maybe I've spent too much time hammering that point across in the book.
No, I think it comes across, for me, I think it comes across well. I mean, I think it's something that, in a way, historians have also noted noted for a long time, which is that probably one of us culturally and universally and historically, one of the few real universals that we have is that, for lack of a better word, like humans play. We play games, we gamble, we like there's never been a culture or society, you know, in which play wasn't a huge part of it in some way, right? And I think it's actually one of the things that actually also, I mean, this is probably something that is things, but in terms of the solidarity aspect, I think it is one of our common touch points of humanity. I mean, I cannot tell you the amount of times I've been in different situations that should be very literally and figuratively foreign to me, and the ability to play a game or to engage with others in, for lack of words, play is something that suddenly connects all of us.
Yeah.
I wonder though, like if one was thinking critically, it's like I think that the danger I see is that, you know, capitalists, I think, have probably caught on to this much quicker than we would like to think. And I think that they're integrating a lot of, if not playment things, which I do think are there, but this kind of like very kind of like, let's try to gamify work, right? Let's try to make work more fun. You have things that people like Peter Fleming have called like neo-normative control, where it's like just be yourself at work, right? And this can go from something as banal like, wear whatever you want and make your cubicle great to, you know, let's, have team building exercises and things. So I think it's in a sense, it kind of in one way reinforces the fundamentality of what I think you're writing about, in the sense that like they couldn't get rid of play and they actually found that play is something that can be weaponized or mobilized. But I think that there's also this kind of aspect of like, well, what would, I mean, this is still a work economy, right? So it's like there's then deeper questions of if we recognize that it's like, what would a play economy look like? And I don't think humans have ever experimented with that. Um, I think we've experimented certainly with the commodified entertainment economy, which, and that was something that when I read your book, I thought was just really interesting was that, for me, really thinking about that part, like you had a really nice part I thought about talking about how Marx was in the 19th century, still had this idea of work as, part of what made one non-alienated as a productive person, right? And it really made me think about, we know that play is quite universal. We know that it's so important. I mean, even capitals, like I said, have recognized that they have that in the workplace. And we spend so little time thinking practically in a kind of like almost Owen-esque way, like, well, what would a play economy look like? Not just bringing play more into our work economy, but like, what would an actual economy based on something that we all do so naturally and spend so much time doing and have always done look like? And that was something that really made me very think a lot about when I read your book, because it's something that, you know, um, it really struck me how little I've actually ever thought about that question.
Yeah.
And how it really touched on, I mean, also ideologically, why haven't I thought about that question? Why haven't we all thought about that question so obviously? Um,
Well, the capitalists, of course, have will take any opportunity to control their workers, even if it manages to approach activity that seems to contradict the whole work situation. I mean, to me, it's like um, teamwork is an aspect of adopting play. I mean, what is a team but, a reference to joint activity that's beneficial to all the concerned. So it's, it's usurping a human quality to want to be a team player. That's, that's it's so ubiquitous now that everyone's on a team. We can't be not on a team after all. we'd be, we're what? We're misanthropes. I mean, or we're eccentrics or whatever. It seems almost verboten to question the idea of team play. But to me, it's more like, okay, you can play. Here's the sandlot. Don't get out of the sandlot. You can play in the sandlot, and that's it. So that's, to me, it's kind of an opening to what a life could be like if there was real team play involved. But it's question, it's obviously just something you do at work. And then the team play you have outside, let's say in your physical activities, maybe tennis or whatever, or after work soccer or something. I mean, that's something else. That's separate. That's a different sort of play, and it's not recognized as play at work, but it's recognized as real play when it's obviously outside of the work situation. I think somewhere Graeber brings up the concept of the work ethic not being questioned, and he thought that was actually the great stumbling block to making change in society is the effect of the work ethic on people. And it does, that sense of commitment to a project gets so skewed when it's imposed upon us, even though we get to play at how we carry it out. It's still imposed on us. We don't have a choice. I mean, we could quit this team, we join another team, but we have to join a team, or we're unemployed and we're non-persons. So, but the thing that bothers me the most is how all this will function in a society where we have less and less control over what team we're in, not because of the job situation, but because of where climate change and resource depletion is taking us. What will a society look like in that situation? That's what motivated me most in terms of how to conceptualize the idea of radical hedonism, is how would we function in a society where we have less and less toys to play with, less and less time to enjoy extraneous activities that aren't imposed on us. I mean, can we all become farmers? I mean, I don't think so, but many of us are going to have to be farmers, I think, if we're going to supply food. If the agricultural businesses deplete the soil to the point where it doesn't produce any food anymore, except with a tremendous amount of artificial stimulation. And same with energy and so forth. I mean, I think we're facing a much simpler society in the future, one that has less complications in terms of not only the supply chains, but less complications in terms of just what we need locally. I mean, California, of course, where I live, is benefits from being able to force basically a desert produce food for most of the country. What if that's no longer possible? And California also has the possibilities of showing some of the way in which, I can get all my food from less than 50 miles around me, maybe less than 25 miles around me, if I wanted to limit my consumption of avocados. I mean, I had an avocado tree in my backyard. It was so old it finally just gave out, but it produced edible avocados for a while. But at the same time, food is going to be a major source of strife in terms of the future, in terms of agriculture, unless we make some drastic changes. So to me, this is a huge problem, and I don't see capitalism as being a solution to it. So if capitalism is not a solution to it, what is a solution? Regimentation, political regimentation to send people into the fields to, grow the cabbages, potatoes? No, it's got to be something that comes out of a sense of well-being that's premised on satisfying our desires for conviviality. You know, that's another thing about Graeber. Graeber comes out of Mauss school of how to pronounce it in French, Mauss school. You know, the Marcel Mauss's whole idea of conviviality and the gifts exchange and so forth. It should be noted that Mauss's other preoccupation was cooperative structures in France. He was a major exponent of cooperative structures, and for the very reason that we're talking about here. This is basic to enjoying our humanity, is functioning collectively with people. And he never brought up play, but in fact, I think the gift economy is basically a playful economy. I mean, you could take the potlatch in the Northwest and see it as an obvious play structure in the society of the Native Americans in the Northwest. You know, who could put the most blankets out on and divest themselves of all their wealth to show how generous they are and how superior they are in terms of accumulating that wealth to give it away. I mean, so there are connections here. There's lots of avenues to take, I think, in devising what would a society based on radical hedonism, as I see it. What functions would it take? How would it be formed? I spent some time on the Polish co-op movement, for example, because at least in the States, no one knows anything about the Polish co-op movement and how large it was. Everyone discusses Mondragon and how impressive it was, or maybe at best better than Mondragon in some senses. Italy and the Emiliano Romano co-ops there, and how creative and innovative they turned out to be. But the Polish co-ops were an immense, huge 3 million person development that was founded on a philosophy of friendship, basically. So how could we devise a real society of friends that made it possible for us to have a play structure in our culture that's integral to our development? It's a good question, and I see co-ops as being a good example of how that could develop. It's not the only example. I think there are a lot of staff-run organizations that have the same elements as co-ops in terms of how they function collaboratively. But co-op, especially the worker co-ops, are like a minor utopia. There is a sense of activity that most people have no conception of except as a utopian enterprise.
Maybe as a way to start moving toward a conclusion, because we're past the hour, but maybe you could think a little bit about the relationship between crisis and utopian thinking, and thinking about co-ops as a kind of seeding. What I mean by that is, I remember a number of years ago, I asked an Argentinian friend, why, when the economy collapsed in Argentina in 2000, 2001, so many people were like, time to take over the factory. And her answer was, well, Argentina's got a lot of annoying Trotskyists. And for years they've been going around banging on about worker control, worker control, worker control. And yes, it was kind of annoying, but they were effective at seeding a certain idea about workplace democracy and worker control, such that when things actually fell apart, people were already thinking, oh, we could do this. So maybe there's a sense in which, let's say we are entering a period of ecological catastrophe. Sorry, not we are in a period of, yeah. It's gonna get messy, right? So is there a sense at which, if every crisis creates new modes of utopian thought, addressing that crisis? Could we be thinking about certain modes of creating cooperative encounters as a way to sort of seed skills of working together pleasurably or not unpleasantly, or as a sort of longer term solution to start building the kind of spaces of encounter to deal with these moments of crisis?
Yeah. So this brings up something I was involved in 2009 to 2011. So, so the worker co-ops in the San Francisco Bay Area are organized into a federation of sorts called No Boss.
Mm.
No Boss stood for network of worker co-ops, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, and several of us in the co-op community and one or two people outside of it, but allied to it and sort of staff-run non-profits, came up with the idea of holding a grassroots festival. And the grassroots festival took place in Oakland. It was an all-day event in which we invited a whole bunch of nonprofits, urban farmers, people involved in healthcare, along with worker co-ops. And the worker co-ops were sort of the anchor for all of it, but it wasn't a no-boss process. It was a process that we set up as what we call ourselves JASECON, JAS Econ, and the JAS stood for just, alternative and sustainable economy. And that brought together over 300 people. We had 4 major workshops. We had a inside and outside venue. The inside had like a fair where people came and set up booths and promoted their either their activity, if it was a healthcare, let's say, their publishing efforts, whatever they were doing. There was an opportunity for them to demonstrate what they were doing. And outside, we had the workshops, some on how to form cooperative structures, how to develop the alternative economy. It was very successful. We were prompted, the 4 of us who were involved in it, were prompted to sort of create our own, to just keep it going. We would have our own nonprofit and just do this. That would be our life's work to do that. But we could start, we set the example. Now it's for somebody else to just like carry it out, do it again. Well, it never happened again, unfortunately. And I think that's probably one of the drawbacks of some of what the co-ops are involved in. Because of all sorts of reasons, I think mainly because of outside funding, the worker co-ops in many places have become siloed into a specific activity, which is basically just promoting their own co-op structure and sort of irrespective of what's going on in the wider society. That's not true everywhere. I think Cincinnati in Ohio is an example of where they allied with unions and created a more larger community of people involved in the economy besides just the worker co-ops. I think that may be happening in Buffalo. One of the best things that's happening in this country in terms of the co-op structure is that there are these nodes in various cities that have developed networks, some like No Boss did in San Francisco, but they're happening in the Rust Belt, and they're happening in the New England and so forth, places where the coastal areas always had lots of co-op development, but not so much in the Midwest. And it's significant that there are developments in like I said, Buffalo, Rochester, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia's real East Coast, but Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and even Dayton. Now Dayton is near Cincinnati, and Cincinnati has influenced the development of a co-op node in Dayton, Ohio. So, and even Chicago, which was where I originated from, have co-op structures that are trying to develop beyond the simple siloed co-op structure. This is the solidarity economy. And I think that the solidarity economy can be a avenue, a venue for taking this one step further and integrating their work for the future and develop some ways of developing a system of recognizing what a future economy would look like given a collapse of resources and so forth.
Mm. I think that's really beautiful, actually. A really comprehensive answer as well to Stephen's question.
I think that is definitely the place to go in the short, medium, and perhaps long term. But with that, I'll say thank you very much for that, Bernard. And thanks for coming along, Peter.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank both of you for your questions and my feeble attempt to try to express what I put in this book. Thank you so much.
I don't bother work don't bother me. I'm just as happy as a bumblebee. Eat when I can get it, sleep most all the time. I don't give a doggone if the sun don't